On the afternoon of July the 29th, 2026, life in southwestern Japan was moving at its usual rhythm. Shoppers were browsing the aisles of a massive mall in Kashima, factory workers were finishing shifts at a paper mill in Yatsushiro, commuters were boarding bullet trains, and families were going about an ordinary Tuesday. Then, at 4:27 in the afternoon, the ground stopped behaving like ground. It rolled, it cracked, it heaved upward and sideways with a violence that the people of Kyushu Island had not felt in a decade. Within seconds, buildings that had stood for generations began to fold in on themselves. A shopping center erupted in flame and smoke, and a country that has spent centuries learning to live with earthquakes was once again forced to confront just how fragile even the most prepared society can be against the raw power of the earth. This is the story of the magnitude 7, one earthquake that struck Kumamoto Prefecture, what happened in the minutes, hours, and days after, and why this single event is forcing Japan to rethink its assumptions about safety, memory, and the future. To understand why this earthquake matters so much, you first have to understand where it happened. Kumamoto Prefecture sits on the island of Kyushu, Japan's third largest island, located in the southwestern part of the country, roughly 900 kilometers from Tokyo. Kyushu is a region of volcanoes, hot springs, and fertile plains, home to around 13 million people if you count the surrounding areas. It is also one of the most seismically active regions on the planet. Japan as a whole sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, a horseshoe-shaped belt that stretches around the edges of the Pacific Ocean, tracing the boundaries where massive tectonic plates grind against each other. This ring is responsible for roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes and is home to the majority of the planet's active volcanoes. Japan alone experiences about 20% of the world's earthquakes of magnitude 6 or higher. A statistic that becomes chilling once you actually witness what one of these events can do to a modern city. Kumamoto, in particular, carries a heavy history with earthquakes. 10 years before this disaster, in April 2016, the same region was struck by a pair of powerful quakes just 2 days apart, a 6. 5 magnitude foreshock, followed by an even more destructive 7. 3 magnitude main shock. That double disaster killed dozens of people, destroyed over 1,000 homes, and left a scar on the region that had only recently begun to heal. Kumamoto Castle, one of Japan's most treasured historical structures, had its walls damaged in that earthquake and required years of painstaking restoration. So when the ground began shaking again on July 28, 2026, it wasn't just a natural disaster striking a random city. It was a region that had already lived through this nightmare once, watching it unfold again. The quake itself struck at 4:27 p.m. local time, with its epicenter located just south of Kumamoto City, close to the city of Uki. The Japan Meteorological Agency measured the magnitude at 7.1. Although the United States Geological Survey initially recorded it slightly differently before adjustments were made. A common occurrence when different monitoring agencies use different seismic models to calculate the strength of a quake. What made this earthquake especially dangerous wasn't just its raw magnitude, but its depth. It was a shallow, crustal earthquake, meaning it originated close to the surface rather than deep underground. Shallow earthquakes tend to produce much more violent shaking at ground level because the seismic energy doesn't have as much distance to travel and dissipate before it reaches buildings, roads, and people. This is part of why the damage was so severe, despite the epicenter not being directly beneath the most populated areas. Japan uses its own measurement for describing the intensity of shaking experienced on the ground, known as the Shindo scale, which runs from 0 to a maximum of 7. Unlike the Richter, or moment magnitude scale, which measures the energy released at the source of an earthquake, the Shindo scale measures how violently the ground actually shakes in a specific location, factoring in soil conditions, distance from the epicenter, and building type. In this earthquake, parts of Kumamoto Prefecture recorded the highest possible reading on that scale, a Shindo 7, the same catastrophic level of shaking recorded during the twin quakes of 2016. A Shindo 7 means it becomes nearly impossible to remain standing without holding on to something. Furniture is thrown across rooms, and even reinforced buildings can suffer serious structural damage. Within minutes of the quake, the Japan Meteorological Agency issued a tsunami advisory for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas, the bodies of water along Kumamoto's western coastline, along with advisories extending to 3 neighboring prefectures. For a country that still carries the trauma of the devastating tsunami that followed the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, any tsunami advisory triggers an immediate and visceral public response. Sirens sounded, coastal residents were urged to move to higher ground, and news broadcasts switched into emergency mode. Fortunately, this advisory was lifted within about 2 hours, as the tsunami that did form remained small and did not develop into the kind of destructive wave that struck northeastern Japan 15 years earlier. Still, for those 2 hours, an already terrified population had to contend with the possibility of a second wave of disaster arriving from the sea, while they were still trying to process what had just happened on land. If you want to understand the human scale of this disaster, the story concentrates most heavily around 2 locations: a shopping mall in the town of Kashima and a paper factory in the city of Yatsushiro. The Aeon Mall in Kashima was, at the moment the earthquake struck, filled with what witnesses estimated to be thousands of people. Aeon is one of Japan's largest retail chains, and this particular mall had reopened only weeks earlier, in June 2026, after being completely rebuilt following damage sustained in the 2016 Kumamoto earthquake. For the local community, the mall's reopening in June had been treated as a symbol of recovery and resilience, a signal that the wounds of a decade ago had finally healed. During the Reconstruction era, after 2016, a supermarket inside that very mall had famously handed out discounted rice balls to earthquake survivors, an act of small kindness that became a lasting symbol of the community pulling together. Now, less than 2 months after its grand reopening, the same mall would become the epicenter of tragedy all over again. When the earthquake hit, the initial shaking caused panic among shoppers and staff, and the mall's management moved quickly, evacuating roughly 3,000 customers out into the parking lot as a safety precaution. For a brief moment, it seemed like the mall had avoided the worst outcome. But shortly after, in a different section of the building where staff members were still working, a gas explosion tore through the structure. Local broadcaster NHK reported that the explosion, most likely caused by a ruptured gas line during the quake, triggered the partial collapse of the mall's upper floor. The second floor came down, trapping an unknown number of employees beneath the wreckage. In the chaotic hours that followed, reports emerged that somewhere between 20 and 30 employees could not be reached or accounted for. Rescue teams worked through rubble, dust, and the constant threat of aftershocks, searching for survivors buried beneath concrete and steel. Local police told Japanese media there had been a significant number of deaths inside the mall, though officials cautioned it would take time to confirm exact numbers. A grim but honest acknowledgement of just how difficult search and rescue operations become in a structure that has partially caved in on itself. At the same time, roughly a dozen kilometers away in Yatsushiro, a very different kind of catastrophe was unfolding at the Nippon Paper Industries factory. The violent shaking caused a large industrial chimney at the plant to collapse, and at least 11 workers were reported trapped in the debris. As rescue crews arrived, they managed to pull 7 workers out alive, but tragically, at least 5 people at the site did not survive. Their deaths confirmed by Kumamoto's prefectural disaster management team. Officials said several more workers remained unaccounted for at the site well into the search and rescue operation, with authorities describing the effort as an urgent race against time, a phrase that would come to define the entire response to this disaster in the days that followed. As if the mall collapse and the factory disaster weren't enough, the earthquake's shaking also caused a crane to fall at another industrial site, killing a Vietnamese technical intern who had only arrived in Japan back in January. 7 of his fellow interns at the same factory managed to evacuate safely, and a Vietnamese woman married to one of the workers was also injured in the chaos. This detail matters because it highlights something often overlooked in disaster coverage: the presence of foreign workers who form a significant part of Japan's labor force, particularly in manufacturing and industrial sectors. Japan has for years relied on a technical intern program that brings workers from countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia to fill labor shortages. And this earthquake was a brutal reminder that these workers, far from home, are just as vulnerable to natural disaster as any local resident. In the immediate aftermath of the quake, the scale of infrastructure damage across Kumamoto Prefecture became painfully clear. Nearly 37,000 homes were left without electricity. Around 15,000 homes lost access to running water, and thousands more had no functioning gas supply. Communication networks in several areas went down entirely, cutting off residents from the outside world at the exact moment they needed help the most. More than 8,000 people fled their homes and sought shelter in emergency evacuation centers, of which over 400 were opened across the prefecture. In the sweltering July heat, with temperatures climbing and humidity thick in the air, authorities scrambled to bring in additional power sources, just to keep air conditioning running inside these shelters, a critical need given how quickly heat exhaustion and dehydration can compound the suffering of already traumatized evacuees. Transportation across the region ground to a halt almost instantly. Bullet train services, the pride of Japan's transit system and normally a symbol of the country's engineering precision, were suspended across Kyushu for emergency safety inspections. Local train lines shut down as well. At Aso Kumamoto Airport, the runway was closed entirely, with officials stating there was no clear timeline for when operations might resume. Even highways were affected, with large cracks splintering across major roads, some of them severe enough to disrupt emergency vehicle access to the hardest-hit communities. If you have ever wondered why earthquake-prone countries invest so heavily in flexible, shock-absorbing infrastructure, this is exactly the kind of event that shows why. Every fracture in a bridge, every buckled section of highway, becomes a life or death bottleneck in the hours after a major quake, when ambulances, fire trucks, and rescue teams are all trying to reach survivors at the same time. hospitals across the region were pushed to their absolute limits within hours. In Uki City, close to the epicenter, one hospital reported it was completely unable to function due to a power outage caused directly by the earthquake, forcing patients and staff into crisis mode with no reliable electricity for critical medical equipment. Another hospital in the same city said it had to suspend new admissions entirely after already taking in 86 injured patients, including 3 in serious condition, simply because it no longer had the capacity to handle any more emergency cases. Elsewhere, a hospital in Yatsushiro City took in around 40 injured people, while a facility in Kumamoto City received roughly 50 more. Passengers aboard high-speed trains that were running at the exact moment the quake struck also sustained injuries, according to train operators, adding yet another layer to the chaos unfolding across the region in those first critical hours. As the death toll began climbing, so did the intensity of the national response. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi addressed the country directly, describing the situation in stark terms, stating that people were still waiting to be rescued and that authorities were engaged in what she called a race against time. She pledged that Japan's government would go all out to locate and save as many people as possible, a promise that mobilized soldiers, firefighters, and specialized rescue teams from across the country. Members of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department's Special Rescue Team boarded helicopters bound for Kumamoto Prefecture, joining local emergency services and Japan's self-defense forces in a coordinated, large-scale search and rescue operation. Japan's Defense Ministry confirmed it had dispatched aircraft to help assess the full scope of the disaster from above, giving officials a clearer picture of just how widespread the destruction really was. In the earliest hours following the quake, the confirmed death toll stood at 13. By the next day, that number had climbed to 18, including the first confirmed death of a foreign national, the Vietnamese technical intern killed by the falling crane. At that point, at least 62 people had been reported injured, 6 of them seriously. As search and rescue teams continued digging through the wreckage of the collapsed mall and the ruined paper factory, the toll continued to rise. By July 30th, just 2 days after the earthquake struck, Japanese officials confirmed the death toll had reached 28 people, with authorities still working to determine whether a handful of additional deaths were directly related to the quake or attributable to other causes during the chaos. Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara confirmed that at least 5 of those deaths came from the explosion that brought down the shopping mall in Kashima, while another 5 were workers who died at the Nippon Paper Industries mill in Yatsushiro. With the crucial 72-hour survival window, the period after a disaster during which the odds of finding survivors alive begin to drop sharply, rapidly closing, rescue teams pushed themselves through exhaustion and sweltering heat, aware that every passing hour reduced the chances of finding anyone else alive beneath the rubble. While all of this unfolded on the ground, seismologists and government scientists were paying close attention to something else entirely: the risk of what comes next. Following the earthquake, a panel convened by the Japan Meteorological Agency issued a sobering assessment stating there was now a relatively higher chance of another major earthquake striking near the Pacific coast of western Japan. This is a critical point that often gets lost in the immediate coverage of a disaster like this. Earthquakes rarely happen in complete isolation. They occur along fault systems and subduction zones where tectonic stress builds and releases in cycles, sometimes over years, sometimes over decades. When one segment of a fault ruptures, it can actually increase stress on neighboring segments, raising the probability of a subsequent quake in the near future. This is part of the reason Japan takes aftershock warnings so seriously, and why residents in the affected areas were urged to remain vigilant for continued strong aftershocks in the days and weeks following the initial quake, along with warnings about the heightened risk of landslides in areas where the ground had already been destabilized. This region's seismic anxiety is also tied to a much larger looming concern that has haunted Japanese disaster planners for years: the Nankai Trough. The Nankai Trough is a massive undersea fault zone running along Japan's Pacific coast, and scientists have long warned that it is overdue for what's often referred to as the Big One, a potential megaquake that could reach a magnitude of 8 or even 9, generating tsunamis capable of devastating vast stretches of Japan's coastline. Government models have estimated that such a Nankai Trough megaquake could potentially kill hundreds of thousands of people and cause catastrophic economic damage running into the trillions of dollars if it were to strike without adequate preparation. While the July 2026 Kumamoto earthquake is not itself part of the Nankai Trough system, seismologists have made clear that any significant seismic activity in the broader region adds another layer of urgency to Japan's long-standing efforts to prepare for that larger, still pending disaster. For anyone trying to make sense of why this earthquake feels so eerily familiar, it helps to place it alongside Japan's long, tragic history of major seismic events. In 1995, the city of Kobe was struck by a magnitude 7, 2 earthquake that killed over 6,000 people a disaster that fundamentally reshaped Japan's approach to building codes, emergency response, and public disaster education. In 2011, the magnitude 9 Tohoku earthquake, one of the most powerful ever recorded anywhere on Earth, triggered a monstrous tsunami that killed more than 15,000 people and caused a triple meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear power plant, an event whose consequences are still being managed today, more than 15 years later. Then, on New Year's Day of 2024, a shallow magnitude 7. 5 earthquake struck the Noto Peninsula on Japan's western coast, killing over 100 people and leaving hundreds more missing in the country's deadliest quake in nearly 8 years. And of course, there was the twin disaster of April 2016 right here in Kumamoto, a 6. 5 magnitude foreshock followed by a devastating 7. 3 main shock that together killed at least 48 people and left more than 100,000 residents displaced from their homes. Seen against this backdrop, the July 2026 Kumamoto earthquake isn't an isolated tragedy, so much as it is the latest chapter in a much longer ongoing story about what it means to build, live, and raise families on some of the most geologically unstable land on the planet. Japan has arguably done more than any other nation on Earth to prepare for this reality. Its buildings are engineered with base isolation systems and dampers designed to absorb seismic energy. Its schoolchildren participate in regular earthquake drills from a young age. Its public alert systems can send warnings to millions of phones within seconds of a quake being detected, sometimes providing precious extra moments to take cover before the worst shaking arrives. And yet, even with all of that preparation, all of that engineering brilliance and institutional experience, a single magnitude 7, one earthquake was still enough to collapse a modern shopping mall, bring down an industrial chimney, kill dozens of people, and displace thousands more within the span of a single afternoon. That, more than any statistic, tells you everything about the sheer, humbling power contained within the movement of tectonic plates. One detail that stood out throughout the disaster response was the checking of Japan's nuclear infrastructure. Given the country's history with the Fukushima meltdown following the 2011 disaster, any earthquake anywhere near a nuclear facility triggers immediate scrutiny. In this case, Japan's Nuclear Regulation Authority confirmed that no abnormalities were detected at 3 nearby nuclear power plants following the Kumamoto earthquake. This confirmation, delivered quickly and publicly, wasn't just a routine update. It was a deliberate effort to prevent the kind of public panic and long-term distrust that followed the Fukushima disaster, when delayed and sometimes unclear communication from both government officials and the plant's operator badly damaged public confidence in the nuclear industry. 15 years later, the speed and clarity of these safety confirmations reflects lessons that were paid for at an enormous human cost. As rescue operations continued into their second and third days, personal stories from survivors began to surface, offering a window into just how terrifying those initial moments of shaking really were. One resident, a 74-year-old man who lived near the collapsed mall, described being at a supermarket just a few blocks away when the earthquake struck. He recalled pushing his shopping cart toward the checkout counter when the shaking began, and within seconds, items were flying off the shelves around him. He said he genuinely believed in that moment that he was going to die, and that the shaking was so intense he found himself completely frozen, unable to move his body at all. Stories like his, repeated in countless variations across the affected region, capture something that statistics and death tolls alone cannot: the sheer, disorienting terror of the earth itself turning violent beneath your feet with absolutely no warning. The economic toll of a disaster like this extends far beyond the immediate human tragedy, and it will likely take months, possibly years, to fully calculate. Rebuilding a collapsed shopping mall, repairing a damaged industrial facility, restoring power and water infrastructure across tens of thousands of homes, repairing cracked highways and getting bullet train and airport operations back to full capacity all require enormous financial investment. For context, the New Year's Day earthquake that struck the Noto Peninsula back in 2024 caused property and economic damages estimated to exceed $1 billion. And that was a disaster centered in a far less densely populated area than Kumamoto Prefecture. Given that this new earthquake struck a region that is home to major shopping infrastructure, an active industrial sector, and critical transportation links connecting western Kyushu, the economic impact here could ultimately prove even more significant, layered on top of the human and emotional cost that no dollar figure could ever fully capture. There's also a broader psychological dimension to disasters like this one that rarely gets the attention it deserves. For a community that had only just finished rebuilding from the 2016 earthquake, watching the newly reopened Aeon Mall collapse again, less than 2 months after its celebrated reopening, carries a weight that goes far beyond bricks and mortar. That mall wasn't just a shopping center, it was a symbol, proof that the community had recovered, rebuilt, and moved forward after tragedy. Its destruction, so soon after being held up as an emblem of resilience, forces survivors to confront the disaster all over again and to grapple with the unsettling reality that no amount of rebuilding can ever fully guarantee safety in a region this seismically active. Mental health professionals who study disaster recovery consistently point out that repeated exposure to trauma, especially when it strikes the very places associated with healing and recovery, can be even more psychologically damaging than a single isolated event, compounding grief, anxiety, and a lingering sense of instability that can last for years after the physical rubble has been cleared away. The international response to the earthquake also arrived quickly, in the way it almost always does when a country as globally connected as Japan is struck by disaster. Foreign governments and international agencies issued statements of condolence and offers of assistance within hours of the news breaking. Diplomatic missions from countries with citizens living or working in Kyushu, including Vietnam, given the tragic death of the technical intern, began working to confirm the safety of their nationals in the region. News networks across the world picked up the story almost immediately, running aerial footage of the collapsed mall and the damaged factory chimney, images that became instantly recognizable, symbols of the disaster. The same way collapsed highways became symbolic of the Kobe earthquake decades earlier, or the wall of water crashing into coastal towns became symbolic of the Tohoku disaster. In an age where smartphone footage and drone imagery spread within minutes, the world doesn't just hear about a disaster like this anymore, it watches it unfold in near real time, which in some ways makes the emotional weight of these events even heavier for viewers far removed from the actual danger. Domestically, the earthquake also reignited a familiar debate in Japanese politics and public discourse, the question of how much more can realistically be done to prepare for the country's next major seismic event. Japan already spends enormous sums annually on disaster prevention infrastructure, earthquake-resistant construction subsidies, and public awareness campaigns. Yet critics point out that older buildings, particularly those constructed before major revisions to seismic building codes following the 1995 Kobe earthquake, remain vulnerable across the country, and that commercial buildings like shopping malls, which combine large open floor plans with extensive gas and electrical infrastructure, present unique risks that residential building codes don't always fully address. Following this disaster, it's likely that Japanese lawmakers and safety regulators will once again revisit these standards, examining whether commercial gas systems in particular need stricter automatic shutoff requirements to prevent the kind of secondary explosion that turned an already dangerous earthquake into something even deadlier at the Kashima Mall. If there's one thing this disaster makes painfully clear, it's just how interconnected every layer of a society becomes in the moments after a major earthquake. It is never just about the shaking itself. It's about whether hospitals have backup power. It's about whether gas lines are properly secured to prevent explosions during structural stress. It's about whether industrial chimneys and support structures are built to withstand shallow, high-intensity shaking. It's about whether evacuation shelters have the resources to keep vulnerable people safe from heat in the middle of a Japanese summer while they wait, uncertain, for news of their homes and their loved ones. Every one of these systems either holds under pressure or fails, and in Kumamoto, we saw both outcomes play out simultaneously. A nuclear safety system that held firm, and a gas infrastructure system that, tragically, did not. As search and rescue efforts pushed past the critical 72-hour mark, attention slowly began shifting from pure rescue toward the long, difficult process of recovery. Engineers began assessing which structures were safe to re-enter, and which would need to be demolished entirely. Local and national government agencies started coordinating temporary housing solutions for the thousands of displaced residents who could not yet return to homes without power, water, or structural safety clearance. Insurance assessors began the painstaking work of cataloging damage across tens of thousands of properties, and grief counselors and support services were deployed to the region, aware that the emotional aftershocks of a disaster like this can often last far longer than the physical aftershocks recorded by seismographs. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how remarkable Japan's disaster infrastructure actually is, even when it can't prevent every tragedy. The fact that a magnitude 7, one earthquake, one capable of causing catastrophic, civilization-ending damage in many parts of the world, resulted in dozens of deaths rather than thousands, speaks to decades of investment in building codes, public education, and emergency response coordination. Compare this to earthquakes of similar magnitude in regions with less developed infrastructure, where death tolls have climbed into the tens of thousands due to widespread building collapse. Japan's system isn't perfect, as this disaster tragically proves, but it represents one of the most sophisticated earthquake response frameworks anywhere on the planet, built from painful experience across generations of exactly these kinds of disasters. Still, questions are already emerging about what could have been done differently, particularly around that gas explosion at the Aeon Mall. Japan has extremely strict building codes when it comes to seismic resistance, but gas infrastructure inside large commercial buildings remains a persistent vulnerability during major shaking events. Ruptured gas lines have been responsible for secondary disasters in multiple past Japanese earthquakes, including devastating fires that swept through parts of Kobe after the 1995 quake. Engineers and safety officials will almost certainly use this event as a case study moving forward, examining whether additional automatic shutoff systems or more resilient gas line designs could prevent similar explosions during future earthquakes. In disaster response, this kind of after-action analysis is standard practice. Every major earthquake becomes a lesson embedded into the next generation of building codes and safety regulations, a slow, grinding process of learning paid for in lives. As the days pass and the death toll continues to be finalized, one thing remains certain. This disaster will be remembered not just for the earthquake itself, but for everything it revealed, about a region still healing from its last disaster, about the hidden vulnerabilities buried inside even the most modern infrastructure, and about a nation that, despite decades of preparation, continues to live under the constant, unpredictable threat of the ground beneath it giving way without warning. The people of Kumamoto have shown remarkable resilience before, rebuilding after 2016 with a determination that turned a devastated shopping mall into a symbol of hope. Now they face the painful task of doing it all over again, carrying with them the memory of those lost, the lessons learned from what failed, and the quiet, unshakable resolve that has defined this community through every disaster it has faced. If this story moved you, or if you learned something new about how Japan handles disasters on this scale, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and consider subscribing if you want to stay updated, as more information continues to come in about the recovery efforts in Kumamoto. Sharing this video also genuinely helps more people understand the real human cost behind headlines that often reduce these events to just numbers and statistics. Behind every death toll figure in this story is a person, a family, a community trying to rebuild, and that context matters just as much as the facts themselves. As rescue teams continue their work and the true scale of this tragedy becomes fully clear in the coming days, one lesson stands above all others. Disaster preparedness is never truly finished. It's not a box that gets checked once and forgotten. It is a constant evolving process, tested again and again by an unpredictable planet that operates on timescales and forces far beyond human control. Japan learned from Kobe. It learned from Tohoku. It learned from the twin quakes of 2016. And now, painfully, it will learn from Kumamoto once more, carrying those lessons forward into whatever comes next, whether that's the aftershocks still rippling through the region today, or the far larger, long-feared Nankai Trough earthquake that scientists continue to warn could strike at any time in the years ahead. For now, the immediate focus remains exactly where it should be, on finding survivors, supporting the displaced, and honoring those whose lives were lost in a disaster that struck without any warning at all in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that no one in Kumamoto will ever forget.